Jurien Bay is a coastal town about 275 kilometers from Perth, located in Western Australia. It is considered to be a family favorite, with great swimming opportunities and beautiful crystal-clear beaches. It's a popular fishing spot, with many species readily available, such as herring and various shark species. Aside from those who enjoy the sport, there's plenty of fresh fish available for those who enjoy eating it without having to catch it first. Amazing restaurants offering hundreds of different styles of cooking. The area is also well known for its Australian sea lions, which are classified as endangered as the population continues to decrease over time. Since Jurien Bay is home to around 21% of the total population of this animal, many people come to visit for a chance to catch a glimpse of them before it's too late. With such a dense population of sea lions in one area, predators are always nearby. The locals know to be careful when entering these waters if they want to make it out alive. On August 19, 1967, Robert Bartle and his friend Lee Warner were preparing their dive at Jurien Bay. They were both in their 20s and were very experienced divers and spearfishers who enjoyed being in the ocean as much as possible. Early in the morning that day, the sea was particularly cool, with a slight swell that seemed even more inviting. The problem with this swell is that it dragged up a lot of sand and silt from the ocean floor, significantly reducing the visibility underwater. There were already other divers in the water by the time they arrived, and many people were practicing for a spearfishing competition that would take place in the next month. They quickly got ready, changing into black neoprene suits and grabbing their single rubber spear guns, ready to see what they could find under the waves. Unfortunately for them, they would find much more than they bargained for, and only one of them would leave the water that day. Using floats, they were towed out into the deeper waters until they were about 700 meters away from the shore. They could see that the sea floor was barren beneath them until they spotted some limestone ledges, which encouraged them to begin their dive. They knew that this environment was favored by large jewfish and were likely to make a decent catch if they went a little deeper. Lee initially remained on the surface to make sure everything was safe, while Robert dived down to investigate the area and see if any fish were hiding within the caves. Unfortunately, he couldn't find any signs of the fish, so decided that it would be best to move to another area instead. He began his ascent back to the surface with Lee, but as he was looking upwards, he spotted a large dark figure barreling towards him from the murky water. He stayed still, staring at the figure as it dove down closer and closer towards him from the surface. He was frozen in fear as he slowly realized the size of the creature swimming towards him. He was quickly face to face with a large great white shark, the most aggressive species of shark in the world. It was around 14 feet long and was using its powerful tail to effortlessly close the gap between itself and Robert. Robert had no time to react. As soon as he realized what was approaching him, it was already too late. The shark grabbed Robert between the hip and the shoulder, sinking its teeth deep into his body. The water immediately started turning red as his blood began to dye the ocean around him. He tried to struggle while punching the shark, but he was no match against an 1,800-pound animal. He felt the animal readjust its grip on his body tighter as it began to shake him with immense force, breaking his neck with whiplash in the process. As it shook him, his body began to break apart like a straw toy in the mouth of a dog. The only mercy that Robert was afforded was that he died relatively quickly. Unlike bears, who will start eating their prey before they have died, great white sharks will focus on killing their prey first to avoid any further resistance. With one final shake, Robert's body was ripped into two, and the shark continued to circle the boat with his upper body still in its mouth, ready to be devoured later. Lee had been watching this attack in horror, seeing his friend brutally attacked and killed in front of him. It was immediately obvious that Robert was dead and there was nothing to be done. But now the shark had spotted him and had begun to circle him about 3 meters below. Seeing his friend Robert's upper body still in the shark's mouth, he knew that it wouldn't hesitate to kill him and that he now needed to fight for his own life. He looked around for something that he could use to save himself and spotted Robert's spear gun floating near him on the surface. He quickly grabbed it and fired it at the animal, hoping to strike it in the eye to scare it away from him. Despite being an experienced fisherman, the anxiety and terror of the situation proved to be too much, and he missed the shot, sending the spear rocketing past the shark's head. The animal was undeterred and continued circling him as it prepared to strike once again. By some miracle, the shark had unexpectedly gotten entangled in the ropes of the floats and the spear gun, triggering the shark to start thrashing in the water trying to free itself. This gave Lee enough time to begin his escape. He hurriedly started swimming back to shore, swimming backwards and keeping the shark in his sights as much as he could to prevent another sneak attack. After an agonizing length of time, Lee reached the surface and pulled himself to shore, finally free from the tirade of the infamous great white shark. Now that he was on shore, he needed to tell someone what had happened. Robert's family had to be told. He ran to Robert's car but was unable to find the keys. Frustrated, he found keys belonging to another diver who was still in the water and took them, deciding that the diver would understand the circumstances in which his car was taken. He drove to a nearby fishing village 10 kilometers away and quickly found someone who owned a boat and begged them for help. He told Harry Holmes the whole story and everything he had seen. He was horrified by the events. He was the skipper of the Gay Jan and immediately agreed to take Lee back out on the water to try to recover Robert's body, hoping that the shark was still entangled in the ropes as before. As the two men were racing out to the shark, they saw other divers in the water and periodically stopped to get them out of the water, explaining what had happened and how the water was not currently safe. The divers very gratefully got into their boat, thanking them for helping them avoid the same fate that had befallen Robert. By the time they reached the dive point, they had a lot of people in the boat keeping an eye out for the shark. Suddenly, someone spotted it, still trapped in the same ropes that Lee had left it. The scene looked like it could have come from a horror movie. Blood and body parts littering the ocean surrounding the shark. They could see that Robert's torso was still in the shark's mouth, but the rest of his body was gone. It had either sank to the seafloor or the shark had already begun to eat his body. The group tried to pull the shark towards the boat to retrieve Robert's body parts, but as they were just within reach, the ropes encasing the shark snapped. The divers quickly pulled back, not knowing how the shark would now react. But luckily for them, it swam away from the scene, taking what was left of Robert with it. It's believed that the shark thought that the men were sea lions, as their black hooded suits would have given them the same appearance as the shark's natural prey. When Robert began to struggle while being bitten, he would have mimicked the natural reaction of a captured seal, which only would have triggered the predator response of the shark. It's unlikely that the shark was aware that it was preying on a human instead of a seal, but as the apex predator of the ocean, everything is considered to be a prey animal to the great white shark. People have been advised to wear different colored suits or stay out of the bay when there are high numbers of sharks, but the area continues to attract thousands of visitors every year despite this. A few months after the attack, a monument was erected by Robert's family to commemorate his life and pay tribute to others who died in such a horrific manner. Around the same time, a radio station posted a $500 reward for the experienced fisherman who could take down the shark responsible for Robert's death. One man, Peter Godby, spent 24 hours throwing whale meat into the water in the hopes of glimpsing the shark, but without success. The reward was widely advertised across Western Australia, although no one was able to ever claim the prize, and the shark was never found. With an average lifespan of great white shark at 40 to 70 years, it's possible that this shark is still lurking the waters off the coast of Australia to this day, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike again, sending someone else to meet their terrifying final affliction.
Saturday, June 5th, 1993, husband and wife Ian and Terry Cartwright were heading out to sea with their 5 children. Ian was skippering the Australian maritime college vessel Riveresco in the Bass Strait just off of the Tasmanian coast. They were headed to the Barrenjoey Seal Convoy on 10th Island. This island is an uninhabited granite outcrop, home to a large breeding colony of Australian sea lions. With up to 400 sea lion pups born every year, the area is a nature reserve offering some excellent diving and snorkeling experiences. Conserving this habitat is important to marine biodiversity and scientific research. Terry Cartwright worked with staff in the Australian Maritime College at the University of Tasmania. The other divers on board River Esco included Stephen Ears, a marine fisheries lecturer at the college, and his colleague, Josephine Osborne. Stephen had invited Terry and Josephine along to enjoy the research he was conducting and observe the behavior of the sea lions. Terry was eager to join in and experience the interactions with the sea lions. They were well known in the area for being very interactive with divers, often displaying playfulness and coming very close to the people in the water. Terry asked Ian to anchor in a channel on the southern side of the island. Ian motored the boat to the spot and released the anchor chain. The depth reader read 15 meters, and they were about 150 meters from the mainland. Ian and Terry's children leaned over the side of the boat and watched as the anchor splashed into the water and disappeared into the depths. With the calm seas, it was easy for Terry, Stephen, and Josephine to put on their gear. Terry slipped into a two-piece wetsuit. She pulled the hood up over her head and slipped into her yellow fins. Stephen lifted her yellow air cylinder onto her back, and Terry clipped it up. Stephen dropped into the water first. He signaled that it was okay to the rest of the crew, and he began swimming away from the boat. Second to enter the water was Terry, closely followed by Josephine. Terry was an experienced scuba diver but hadn't been in the water for over a year. She was excited to be back amongst the marine wildlife that she loved so much. Once in the water, Terry signaled that she was okay, but she was fumbling with her equipment. She bobbed about on the surface as she tried to adjust the regulator and her mask. Assuming Terry was close behind them, Stephen and Josephine began swimming on the surface of the water towards 10th Island. As they did so, seals came swimming up to them, their whiskered faces merely inches from their masks. Stephen ducked his head underwater. Below them, the sea lions were darting about, swimming up to the diver's feet and then swimming back down. The sea was a hive of activity. Terry's husband, Ian, and another crew member, Ian Rinkin, both shouted at Terry, signaling for her to hurry up and catch up to the others. She was lagging behind, and it was safer for them to stick together as a group. Finally, Terry sorted out her equipment and turned around to see her friends 20 meters away. She swam to catch up. Despite not being in the water for a long time, Terry was a fit 35-year-old and caught up to the others in no time. The three of them bobbed on the surface together for a few moments before descending just meters from the rocks of 10th Island. As they dropped beneath the ocean's surface, Terry marveled at the scenery. The visibility was fantastic, and she watched as the sea lions glided by effortlessly. Stephen and Josephine made it to the bottom of the ocean and looked up to see Terry paused in her descent. Terry felt the pressure build in her ears. She pinched her nose and blew, but nothing happened. Each time she continued to dive deeper, the pressure in her ears grew. She tried again and again to equalize her ears. Then suddenly, from out of nowhere, she was hit with an incredible force. It knocked the air from her lungs as she was thrown through the water. The regulator was ripped from her mouth and an explosion of bubbles surrounded her. Stephen and Josephine hovered just above the sea floor, shocked as they saw a 15-foot great white shark torpedo directly into Terry. Disoriented, Terry wheeled around as the shark came at her once more. Its enormous mouth clamped down around her torso, and she let out a muted cry, air bubbles escaping from her mouth. Stephen and Josephine looked on in horror as a shadow of red engulfed their friend. As the shark ravaged her, thrashing her body around in the water, they hid behind the underwater rocks, hardly daring to peek over the top. The sea lions all dispersed, swimming away or leaping out of the water onto the island. The two divers froze in terror. They desperately wanted to reach Terry, but they couldn't see where the shark was. Then, as Stephen decided to make a dash towards Terry's limp body, they saw the toothy grin of the shark emerge through the red-stained murkiness. Its powerful tail drove it through the water at 16 miles per hour. Its top lip curled backwards as its immense jaws opened once more and grabbed hold of Terry again. It dragged her deeper and deeper until Terry was out of sight. Stephen and Josephine made a dash for the island and resurfaced as quickly as they could. Ian and the children had been watching from the boat. They had seen a commotion but were unaware of the horror that had occurred in the depths. When Stephen and Josephine frantically made it out of the water and onto 10th Island, they shouted and screamed at Ian to bring the boat over. Knowing there was some kind of emergency and seeing that Terry hadn't resurfaced, Ian Cartwright and Ian Rinkin jumped into the 11-foot dinghy and rowed as quickly as they could to the island. Hearing the heart-stopping news of his wife, the distraught Ian took charge and searched the area in his boat for over half an hour. He then had to deliver the devastating news to their 6-year-old quadruplets and 11-month-old son who were waiting patiently on the boat. With no sign of Terry above the water, Ian radioed Bell Bay for help and a sea and air search was initiated. During the afternoon, pieces of Terry's wetsuit surfaced a kilometer away from the attack site. One of her legs with the yellow fin still attached was also pulled from the sea. No other trace of Terry was ever found. When we enter the enchanting underwater world of the marine environment, we must always remember that we are amongst predators of all kinds and that this is their domain, not ours. With an abundance of prey in the waters off 10th Island, great white sharks frequent the area. They typically take young sea lion pups that are inexperienced in the water. Any injured sea lions or stragglers are easy pickings for a 15-foot great white. As Terry had paused midway in the water column, suspended briefly as she tried to equalize her ears, she may have been interpreted as a struggling sea lion. Dressed predominantly in black and amongst swarms of sea lions, many believe that it was a case of mistaken identity. A devastating and heartbreaking case of mistaken identity that led Terry Cartwright to her horrifying final affliction.
Great whites are truly terrifying creatures and are considered by many to be the undisputed apex predators of the open waters. Naturally, they are regarded as some of the best hunters in the animal kingdom, thanks in large part to their ability to detect blood from up to 5 kilometers away. Their torpedo-shaped bodies also give them the speed and power they need to swim up to 57 kilometers per hour, which they use to quickly ambush and take down unsuspecting prey with surprising force. Adult great white sharks have a lifespan of 30 years, a maximum length of around 20 feet, and can weigh up to 6,600 pounds on average. The largest recorded great white is thought to be 7 meters, 23 feet, weighing 2.5 tons. Great whites also sport razor-sharp teeth that can grow up to 6.6 inches tall. They are known to be opportunistic predators, which means they take advantage of whatever opportunity for food comes their way. Their diet consists of anything from the ocean's surface all the way down to the sea floor. And as great whites grow in size, so does the range and type of prey they go after. Smaller great whites will typically eat fish, rays, and crustaceans. But when they get larger, their diet also starts to include creatures like seals, sea lions, dolphins, seabirds, humans, and even other sharks. Nick Peterson, aged 18, was with 3 friends 300 meters from shore at West Beach, South Australia. The sky was clear and cloudless, a perfect day for scurfing. Scurfing is a water sport that combines the best of both worlds, the excitement of skiing with the freedom of surfing. Nick and his friends, Ty Wheeler, Adam Floriani, and Andrew Tomlin, all teenagers from Adelaide's western suburbs, had been swimming for half an hour and taking turns on the surfboards. As they were enjoying themselves, little did they know that a full-grown great white, almost 6 meters tall, with a viciousness to match its size, was stalking the group from afar, likely studying them, trying to find the easiest target, and patiently waiting for an opportunity to strike. Large white sharks were a common sight in the area where Nick and his friends were enjoying their hobby. Almost 3 weeks prior to the incident, 2 men in a boat were nudged by a 5-meter white shark as they fished 10 kilometers off the shore of St. Kilda, north of Adelaide. The next day, a shark of the same size terrorized fishermen off North Haven before making swimmers scramble for safety at Tennyson, Henley Beach, and Glenelg beaches. In addition, on December 2nd, a shark was seen far out in Gulf St. Vincent. Gary Biddle from the Grange Surf Life-Saving Club said he saw a white shark swim under his boat while offshore at Grange the previous weekend. In the hours leading up to this tragedy, Lenka Merzlikova, a tourist from the Czech Republic, unknowingly witnessed something truly terrifying. It was the sight of an enormous black dorsal fin 30 meters away from the shore she had caught a glimpse of while looking out to sea. At first glance, she thought it might be a dolphin and decided to do little more than take a picture. As one of his friends was getting back onto their boat, Nick gleefully jumped into the water. That was when disaster struck. As soon as Nick's body touched the water, he was caught off guard by a gaping maw lined with razor-sharp teeth, lunging at him with unfathomable force after emerging from underneath the waters. The array of sharp teeth sank deep beneath Nick's flesh, grabbing him by the left shoulder and viciously shaking him around in an attempt to tear off large chunks of his body. Nick was writhing in pain, and his friends made the hopeless effort of trying to rescue him by hitting the water with their paddles, but it was too late. The vicious shark would circle around and then submerge with Nick still in its jaws numerous times before submerging one final time. Nick was gone for a second at this point, but before his friends could even process what had just happened, Nick resurfaced, and as soon as his friends shifted their gaze toward him, they were all mortified beyond words by what they saw. It was Nick, now floating face down, motionlessly, and with his lower half completely gone. Nick's body drifted amidst an unholy pool of blood, tissue, and half-torn organs. Immediately after the attack, Nick's mates raced south to the Adelaide Shores boat ramp. Minutes later, one of the teenagers ran up the beach in tears, shouting to swimmers to get out of the water. Later on, it was rumored that another smaller 14.5-foot great white was briefly glimpsed feeding on the vestiges. This took place while hundreds of people were present at the shoreline, and after a meticulous beach and sea search, the only found remnants of Nick Peterson were 2 small pieces of one of his lungs. Out of all the tissues in the human body, researchers have found that samples belonging to one's lungs are the only ones that may escape being consumed during fatal shark attacks. This is because pulmonary tissue is full of air, making it buoyant and causing it to rise quickly to the surface. If someone dies from the attack itself rather than by drowning, this phenomenon enables rescuers to determine what exactly transpired in cases where no witnesses are present. One of Nick's friends, Ty Wheeler, remembers that fateful day perfectly. "I was watching Andrew in the water while Nick was driving, and we saw dolphins," he said. "We turned the boat around and it was just so magical, so we decided to drive closer to them." It is theorized that one of the so-called dolphins they saw was, in fact, Nick's would-be assailant. In what must have been a difficult and traumatizing retelling of the horrible events which had transpired, Ty recalls that the shark struck so quickly that the teens barely had time to react. Nick's body was literally torn in half within seconds, and then a second smaller shark moved in to feed on the remains. Over time, the water near the beach became red with blood and filled with unrecognizable body parts, some of which even washed ashore in what must have been quite a disturbing sight for anyone present. The only thing that was found during the later search were some pieces of Nick's lung. South Australian Sea Rescue Squadron spokesman Fraser Bell stated, "The shark tore him in half and the other shark came in and took the rest." When asked if there was any chance Nick may have survived, Bell's shocking reply was simply, "None whatsoever." The police shut down several beaches in the area soon after the attack was reported. They began searching by air and sea at 3:30 p.m., sending patrols along the beach to warn people about what had happened. As previously stated, it was thought that the 2 white sharks had carried out the attack together. These sharks were reported to be approximately 4.5 meters and 5 meters long, respectively. However, further investigation showed that only a single 5 to 6 meter white shark was involved in the attack. Local experts said that it was likely the same shark that had been seen near Adelaide beaches in previous weeks. Although white sharks are a protected species in Australia, officials still held a meeting on December 18th and decided that the specific shark responsible must be found and killed. On that very same day, Nick's parents, Philip and Leonie Peterson, were interviewed at West Beach. They stated, "We don't advocate the indiscriminate killing of any shark. They are to be admired, appreciated, and respected, and Nick knew that," said Philip Peterson. Unsurprisingly, two of Nick's friends had to undergo therapy due to the devastating trauma they went through, a trauma that may never fully heal or depart from their memories. Nevertheless, the tragic story of Nick Peterson is a reminder that sharks are a part of the natural environment. It is important to respect their natural instincts to seek food and not disturb them. Always remember that even though shark attacks are rare, nothing in this world is certain. Both tragedy and fortune are likely outcomes when spinning the wheel of fate, and no one should ever feel too comfortable in shark territory, especially if they are not familiar with the area. It is crucial to always be aware of your surroundings and take caution when swimming in an area where these majestic animals are known to roam, because if you don't, you may find yourself little more than a formless mass of flesh and bone, drifting atop the crimson-red waters, with your last thoughts being of your final affliction.
On the 16th of February 2022, 35-year-old Simon Nellist, along with his fiancée Jessie Ho, had gone out to the Little Bay Beach in Sydney, Australia. As a veteran of the British military and twice having served in Afghanistan, Simon wanted to enter the Malabar Magic Ocean swim event held annually in South Sydney. A few weeks prior to the swim, he decided it was a good time to practice in the calm and safe waters of Little Bay. The greater ocean along the beach was prone to sharks, but over the years, effective management, alarm systems, tracking, and deep netting in the water had made sure no fatal shark attacks happened at the beach for over 6 decades. The area had been declared safe for swimmers and surfers by the New South Wales administration, and for many at this bustling and lively beach, sharks were often the last thing on their mind. Great white sharks over 15 feet or 4.5 meters in length were not an anomaly in the greater stretches of the open water. The species is regarded as the most dangerous animal of the sea for humans, with hundreds of recorded shark fatalities in history and some of the most horrifying stories of brutal deaths enough to send chills down anyone's spine. Great whites have been known to prefer eating larger animals as they grow. With serrated teeth over 6 inches in length, it can maul to pieces any human that dares venture close. On that fateful day at 4:30 p.m., Simon set out to take advantage of the daylight before evening set in, to train for the charity swimming event to be held in a few weeks. There were several fishermen, surfers, and swimmers on the beach as he swam further off the shore over 150 meters into the sea. The calm ambience of the scene suddenly turned into a rush of splashing water and screams of agony. An enormous great white shark swam up from the bottom underneath Simon and bit into his torso, burying its sharp teeth right into him. The shark exploded out of the water out of nowhere, rising several feet above before splashing back in with Simon firmly in its grip. Onlookers were horrified at the sight as they realized what had just happened. One eyewitness described the shark's plunge back into the water as resembling a car hitting the ocean from high above.
The shark just hit him like that and came back down and just started eating him, that was it.
The shark came out the water, grabbed someone from their side, was thrashing around and pools of blood in the water. It's horrible.
Most of the video too horrific to show.
Big great white, that's a great white. Oh man, oh no. Oh no, someone just got eaten by a shark.
At just a few meters, Simon was not very far from the shore, and his agonizing death was witnessed up close by dozens of terrified and helpless beachgoers. In his final moments, Simon tried frantically to hit the shark or wriggle out of its grip, but to no avail. Simon's fate has now been sealed, and the great white shark took one last plunge deep into the ocean. 34-year-old Simon, a veteran and a fiancé, was never seen again. Great white sharks have been known to hunt seals and sea lions, but this was the first attack against a human victim that this beach had witnessed in 60 years. As one of the deadliest shark species to exist, they are known to launch surprise attacks on their prey and shoot up from underneath their victims, biting and gripping them in their jaws. Only a few body parts could be salvaged from the site to return what remained of Simon to his friends and partner. Immediately after the horrifying attack, lifeguards called everyone back from the water and sealed off the beach. Rescuers set off on jet skis and helicopters to try and find the shark, but it could not be located or identified. Experts could not decipher why the tragedy happened despite heavy guarding of the area from sharks. Though great whites were known to be highly dangerous, humans were not their usual prey. They fed on larger animals like the seal, rays, and even other smaller sharks. It was later discovered that Simon had put on a wetsuit before going for the swim. It wasn't common for swimmers in these calm waters to don these tight gray suits at the beach. The cause of the attack against Simon was ruled as a probable misidentification on the part of the shark. The dark gray swimsuit made Simon's body look similar to that of a seal, which was one of the shark's primary prey. Great white sharks have a powerful sense of smell, and it was likely that it smelled Simon before it could see it. As the shark torpedoed toward him from beneath the water, it was too late to abort the attack, and Simon soon found himself bitten in half and pulled under. Simon's entire family was devastated at the news of his brutal demise, and his fiancée Jessie's entire world came crashing down just a few weeks before their wedding. In honor of Simon Nellist, the Malabar Magic Ocean swim got cancelled. The participants visited the beach to pay their respects and gather in a moment of silence. All across his life, Simon had been a lover of the sea. He had been advocating against the culling and caging of sharks for a long time and was disturbed at the interference of the natural food chain that human action had been creating in the oceans. Unfortunately, his life came to an end inside the jaws of the same animal he had long fought for conserving. The news of the shark attack spread like wildfire across the world and reignited fears of shark attacks in Australia. Simon was remembered by his friends and colleagues as a man of integrity and charisma. He loved the vastness of the ocean and wanted to do everything he could to save it from the negative consequences of human action. As a diving instructor himself, he was aware of the impact of shark nets and drum lines that had been disturbing the natural balance of marine life in that region. He campaigned for the protection and conservation of the sea and all animals that live in it. Simon was also remembered as an empathetic human being. His last Facebook post was his reflections on the children of Afghanistan, many of whom he had befriended during his military service in the country. The incident, which happened in early 2022, is still fresh in collective memory and is an addition to a long list of gruesome shark attacks that serve as a grim reminder of how quickly humans can go from being predator to being prey. But for Simon Nellist's family, it turned one of their happiest moments of getting their son married in a grand wedding into a nightmare that scarred them for life. Simon Nellist's relatives had already booked their tickets to Australia, but now instead of his wedding, they arrived there to attend his funeral. It just goes to show that tomorrow is not a promise for anyone, and that any day could be the day you meet your untimely, final affliction.
March 22, 2014 in South Africa dawned bright and warm. Summer had just winded down the month before, and even though it was technically already autumn, that year the heat hung around long enough for just a little while longer. The Austrian group of tourists that landed down had chosen this time specifically. Early autumn is still warm enough to enjoy the beaches, but not so blisteringly hot that their light European skin would suffer in the African sun. Right on the very tip of the country, bordering the Indian Ocean, lies the small holiday town of Port St. John's. The Indian Ocean is much warmer than the sometimes freezing Atlantic Ocean that lies on the other side of the country. And as you can imagine, it's along this coastline where most of the swimming, surfing, and snorkeling happens. The beaches are almost always packed, unless it's in the dead of winter. And even then, there are always a handful of die-hard surfers still willing to go out into the waves. As popular a destination as Port St. John's is, it's not very well patrolled. The reality is that of all of South Africa's nearly 3,000-mile coastline, every single inch of it is swarming with deadly sharks. Places like Jeffreys Bay, the Durban beaches, and Hartenbos are just busier and require the most attention. Port St. John's is not exactly on most tour groups' lists of hotspots. It's mostly frequented by locals, so it doesn't get as much traffic as the rest. You won't see any lifeguards here, and patrol vessels are at a minimum. Only the shark warning signs that dot the beach gives any indication that there might be any danger here. But in fact, it's one of the country's busiest breeding grounds for the colossal man-eating bull sharks. Had this group of Austrians, mostly made up of retirees, known this, maybe they'd have sought out another beach to cool off in. They only came to visit the iconic African safaris, the easy mountain trails, and they wanted to try out the local cuisine. But as soon as they landed, all of them decided that it was a good idea to find some water before heading inland to see the wild animals. Even along the coast, and in autumn no less, the heat was getting to them all. Frederick Bergstaller and his wife Margit practically threw themselves at the water when they arrived. The rest of the group were a little hesitant to get in themselves, not for fear of any danger. Instead, they found the packed beach a little claustrophobic. At 66, Frederick was still an excellent swimmer. He just needed to get past the first few shallow waves, and he'd be out of the crowd, where he could stretch out his arms and swim in the ocean that was virtually empty after those first few yards. Margit was content to roll up her pant legs and wade in the surf up to her ankles and watch her husband weave through the dozens of youngsters and families who were having an absolute ball, splashing and playing. All of the feet treading through the water was kicking up so much sand that there was virtually no visibility. The water just looked mucky and brown from above. But even if someone had been sharp enough to see a hint of the gray body that was stalking the swimmers from below, the noise of the beach would have dampened any shouts of warning. The animal had been moving just out of reach, hoping to hone in on one person in particular. But the mass of moving limbs was confusing. Every time it decided on a target, the whole mass of people's patterns shifted, and it had to start hunting all over again. That's until Frederick stepped into the water. Just as he got in up to his waist, he turned around to wave at Margit. Those few seconds he spent to stand still was enough for the shark to focus on him, and his stark white skin didn't help the situation much. Among the bodies and the shades of brown and black around him, Frederick stood out like a beacon in the murky water. It's almost no surprise that he was the one that the predator finally got a lock on. Poor Frederick was doomed the moment he set foot in the water. Frederick turned back to face the open sea, getting ready to dive headfirst in to catch some speed to swim out even farther, when the beast reared out of the dark. Frederick stumbled back, but it was too late, and the shark was too close. It grabbed him by both of his legs and lifted the man clear out of the water. It was like an explosion. One moment all was well, and the next there was absolute chaos when the animal and man burst out of the water, scattering the crowd instantly. Flecks of red and blue showered the people as they ran and shoved each other out of the way. The sudden uproar of stamping feet, splashes, and panicked screams were so deafening that it drowned out Frederick's own screams of fear and pain. The upsurge of chaos was so bewildering that the shark's jaws slacked for just a moment. That was all Frederick needed to rip himself free. Pushing with his hands against the animal's snout, he could feel the razor-sharp teeth tear through his skin as he pulled himself loose. In the instant that Frederick was free, he turned and began to run on his torn and shredded legs, but his limbs just couldn't hold him up after the beating that they just took. Frederick went down before he even took 2 steps in the direction of the retreating crowd. The beast was on him again. Horrified, Margit and the crowd saw Frederick pull back to throw a punch. He would have hit the approaching 2-meter-long monster square in the nose, but almost like it had been anticipating this very reaction, the shark opened his mouth just as Frederick's fist shot forward. His arm sank into the deep and dark gullet right up to his shoulder. And yes, the shark bit down, taking the entire right arm clean off the socket. Lifting his only remaining arm, Frederick attempted one last time to land a punch, but with legs that didn't work and a spewing hole where his right arm used to be, he simply sank beneath the surface with a final spray of blood that was swallowed by the water. Huddled on the sands, the crowd huddled in terror, no one daring to go into the vicious splashing that was happening just yards from them. Helpless, they were forced to watch as the shark fed on Frederick right in front of their eyes. Margit, hysterical, attempted to run into the surf, but 2 South African teenagers stopped her from running to her death. She struggled so fiercely that one of the boys, a 19-year-old, had to push her into the sand and sit on top of her to keep her out of the water. He begged for her to stop, while the other boy grabbed her hand, promising to stay with her. The terrible scene went on for another 15 minutes before the waters finally became still, and there were no longer any signs of violent splashing. And only then did emergency services arrive. But their only job now was to fish what was left of Frederick out of the water and to get the traumatized Margit to the hospital. That young boy held onto her hand until the ambulance doors closed and he was left standing on the beach, watching the ambulance drive away. Another vehicle took Frederick's remains away. Besides his right arm, Frederick's entire lower body was gone, and most of the organs in his abdomen had spilled out too. You'd think that such a gruesome death would mean the end of swimming at Port St. John's. But no, less than an hour later the surf was full of people again, none of them even aware of the terrible attack that had just happened in the very waters that they were swimming in. And even now, 14 years later, there are still no lifeguards or boats patrolling the waters. Just a handful of signs that stand crooked and rusting in place to warn swimmers of the danger beneath the waves, until someone else is inevitably taken by the gray monsters that lurk beneath the surface and meets their own terrifying final affliction. It was whale migration season off the coast of Western Australia. Drawn towards their migration route, great white sharks are known to head northwards to meet the returning whales. This is often when the whales are most dangerous, as the shark population swells and they prowl the coastlines in greater numbers. One of the things known about great white sharks, and that is they are solitary hunters. They don't hunt in packs, a behavior that has been documented in other shark species. But that was about to change as passionate surfer 29-year-old Bradley Smith entered the water on July 10, 2004. From Shoalwater, 41 kilometers west of Australian state capital Perth, Bradley and a group of friends paddled out into the Indian Ocean. They were surfing at Left-Handers Beach, south of Gracetown, near Margaret River. The beach is a popular spot and is considered safe for more junior surfers. Nobody could have predicted what happened that day. As Bradley and his friends lay on their boards, floating on the surface of the ocean, not one, but two great white sharks prowled below the waves. Cooperative hunting is not documented in great white sharks, but these two clearly had their eyes on the same prize, the silhouetted figures of the surfers above them. After swimming along the coastline, the two sharks began to swim up through the water column. They headed directly for the surfers and began to power towards the surface. Bradley's friends looked over to see the terrifying shadow of a great white shark. It was so enormous that they described it as wide as a car. It was the megalodon of modern times, and it was heading straight for Bradley. Before anybody could get out of the way, there was suddenly an eruption of water right beside Bradley, and he was thrown off his board. The shark that made the hit was estimated to be 4.5 meters, almost 15 feet long. But that's when the group of friends spotted a second shark. When Bradley hit the water, he knew what was coming. He knew he had been struck by a shark and desperately grappled to get back onto his board. But the sharks were in attack mode. As the smaller of the two, at 3 meters, 10 feet long, circled Bradley whilst he splashed in the water, the other came in for the kill. Its dark shadow torpedoed below the other surfers heading straight for Bradley. His friends could only look on in horror as the dorsal fin sliced through the surface moments before it opened its jaws just feet from where Bradley trod water. Seconds later, the shark grabbed him, and he was pulled under the surface. The sharp, serrated teeth dug into his flesh, holding him in a vice-like grip. But Bradley was an incredibly brave young man and refused to give up. He thrashed around in the shark's jaws, hitting it and kicking with his legs. Miraculously, he made it back up to the surface as the shark let go for a moment. But Bradley wasn't dealing with just one shark. He was dealing with two, and the blood that now poured from his open wounds incited the marine predators, and a feeding frenzy ensued. At that point, there was so much commotion in the water, so much splashing and bubbling and boiling, that it was impossible to tell which shark was attacking Bradley. It was a desperate fight for survival, and a devastating thing for his friends to witness. His mates, still on their surfboards just feet from where Bradley was being attacked, implored him to escape. With every fiber of their bodies, they willed him to make a break for it. "Swim for your life, mate," they shouted. "Swim for your life." That's exactly what Bradley was trying to do. But as each of the sharks came at him again and again, he couldn't fend them off. He kept punching them with his fists and pushing them away as their snouts broke through the surface right next to him. But it was a losing battle. One of his friends rushed to the shore and ran out of the water to call for help. He dialed 000 and turned to look back at the sea, shocked and shaken by what he had just witnessed. Seeing how enormous the sharks were and how intense their attack was, his friends knew Bradley was in the fight for his life. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity. The two sharks had been on the hunt, and they had settled on Bradley as their prey. It was such a rapid and ferocious attack by two absolutely giant sharks that at one point, when one of the sharks opened its jaws to bite Bradley, an eyewitness described the jaws as wide as the length of a man's arm. The shark could have swallowed Bradley whole. With both great whites furiously biting, tugging, and pulling at the young man, his body was practically torn in two. After 45 seconds of relentless attacking, there was a break in the feeding frenzy, and Bradley's body floated on the surface, motionless. His friends seized their opportunity. With the two man-eaters just feet away, they frantically paddled over to Bradley, who was now surrounded in a dark cloud of red seawater. Bravely, his friends grabbed hold of him. He was no longer moving. He no longer had any fight left in him. He had bled out from the attack just yards from dry land and only feet from some of his best friends. As the friends pulled Bradley towards the shoreline, he left a trail of blood behind them. It was tantalizing for the two sharks, and the short paddle to the beach felt like an eternity as the friends thought that they might be next. Not daring to look behind them, they focused on the shore and the safety of the beach. Finally, they made it to the shallows and dragged Bradley out of the water. With the friends too traumatized to describe Bradley's injuries, another eyewitness told media that Bradley had been torn in half. It's something that you may see in the movies, but you never for 1 second think that it is something that is going to happen to one of your best friends. Bradley's board was brought to shore afterwards. It had been completely snapped in half by the shark's razor-sharp teeth. The bite mark was testament to just how massive the great whites had been. Following the harrowing tragedy, marksmen in a flotilla of boats who were accompanied by a police helicopter scoured the ocean for the two man-eating giants. Normally, great white sharks are protected, and it is forbidden to hunt them. But fisheries officer Tony Capilouti said that if a shark poses a significant threat to humans and has attacked before, then officers are always authorized to kill it. As the search party headed out into the surf, there was no sign of the two sharks. They had likely been scared off by the sound of the engines and the commotion. But there was dispute amongst many Australians. As is often the case after an attack, the debate about whether or not to kill those responsible arose. Shark nets that are installed along some stretches of the Australian coast are not considered effective and pose significant risk to other marine life. Authorities worry that if a shark has tasted human blood, then they may be more likely to attack people again. But a few days after the attack, words of support for the two sharks were spoken by the most unlikely of people, Bradley's brother. He said that a revenge killing wasn't going to bring his brother back, and it's not what Bradley would have wanted. An uneasiness came over locals when a week passed and no sign of the two enormous sharks was found. They had vanished from the coastal waters, and with the ability to travel more than 100 miles a day, the search area was now huge. Marine experts were surprised by the behavior of the two sharks. Eyewitnesses reported one shark knocking Bradley off the board and the other coming in to attack him. It seemed like a collaborative hunt, something else that added to the uneasiness of the locals. But for most avid surfers, the terrible attack wasn't going to stop them going into the water. When the very same beach was reopened following the tragedy, surfers were back out in the waves. They knew the dangers, and their love for the sport far outweighed any fear they may have of being eaten by a shark and meeting their own final affliction. Therese and Ian Cartwright loved the ocean. Fishing, kayaking, and snorkeling were some of their favorite pastimes. They'd been doing one activity or another centered around the sea since they started dating in their early 20s, and it was a habit they kept up all throughout their marriage. After having their first baby, Therese took nearly a year off from water activities after their son was born, and her next pregnancy required an even longer hiatus from her beloved waves because Therese and Ian soon found out that they were going to be parents of quadruplets. With all those babies to carry, Therese couldn't even float in the shallows. She was just too heavy and uncomfortable to even try. And when the 4 new little Cartwrights finally arrived, well, keeping 4 busy babies occupied kept Therese out of the fun for 2 more years. The little Cartwrights were being raised to love the water just as much as their parents, and soon they were paddling the water with their arm floaties alongside their big brother, too. The family trip that took place in June of 1993, when Therese was 34 years old, was a little different, though. She hadn't gone snorkeling outside of short outings along the coastline every now and then, and she'd been itching to make a day of it for years now. While their eldest son decided to stay behind to visit his grandparents for the week, the rest of the Cartwrights went on a week-long holiday with 2 of Ian's work colleagues and another family friend along for the ride. They rented a motorized boat and decided to spend that first day on Barrenjoey Island, right off the coast of Tasmania, scuba diving in the midst of seal and sea lion colonies. The quads were 6 years old, so they were at least content to stay safely on the boat while the grown-ups took turns going into the water so that there was at least one adult with the children at all times. Everyone knew, even back in 1993, that diving amongst a pack of seals, as fun as it can also be incredibly dangerous. Seals and sea lions aren't much of a danger to humans. If anything, their underwater acrobatics and playful natures make them the perfect sea mammals to view up close for divers. It's the predators that are drawn to them. That's the problem. Sharks of all kinds follow colonies like moths to a flame. Hammerheads, tigers, and the fearsome great white can almost always be seen somewhere in the vicinity. Since the mammals are so numerous and they congregate in pockets where schools of fish are moving through, there's usually so much going on that the predators are much more likely to go for the seals, their natural prey, than they are to bother with the humans that swim and dive in shallow water where they can't hunt as comfortably. Unfortunately, a human in a dark wetsuit and a sea lion don't look that much different from one another from a distance. It just takes one unlucky human being in the wrong place at the wrong time for a predator to target the wrong species. Sure enough, the morning started out great. Ian took to the water first, where he and the other 3 men had a grand time snorkeling amongst the rocky underwater outcrops, and there were plenty of curious seals that made an appearance to observe the strange humans in their waters. Some of them came so close that the divers could have touched them if they wanted to. After 2 hours, just a little before 10 that morning, Ian and one of his colleagues got out of the water to relieve Therese, where she'd been setting out lunchboxes and toys for the quads so that they could keep themselves busy. But they weren't very interested in their toys. They made a game of watching the leaping sea lions hanging out by the railings, where Ian had to keep a hand close to their puffy little jackets in case they slipped and fell. The other 2 men were still in the water, weaving in and out, having their own little game to see who could collect the most mussels from the rocks beneath. Therese got in, strapped her goggles on, and spent the first few minutes floating topside with her face down, watching the darting animals in the 30-foot deep water below her. It was those few minutes that she took to acclimate to the water which was the biggest mistake that Teresa could have made. The 15-foot great white shark that had been stalking in the background was waiting for just such a moment. Under the water, sea lions and seals were incredibly fast, so sharks don't bother targeting them as the mammals are hunting. It's when a seal floats on the surface of the water to take a moment to catch its breath and rest from expending all of its energy catching fish that they normally strike. To the predator, Therese looked just like any other seal. She was still for just long enough that it bolted out of the deep, gunning straight for Therese's lazily floating figure. Therese just saw the two sea lions below her shoot off into the water without realizing that they were fleeing for their lives and that this was not just another one of their aquatic games. With no warning and no sense of her doom streaking toward her, the shark snapped its jaws around the soft tissue of Therese's waist. It came with such great speed that they were both catapulted out of the water, breaking the surface in an almost graceful arc, leaving a trail in the air of red spray and ribbons of torn intestines. When they struck the water at the end of their arc, the force was so great that the animal's teeth slammed right through Therese, taking most of her abdomen in one single swallow. Therese had a fleeting moment of terror, a jab of pain, and then it was all dark. She died almost instantly. Torn in half, the trauma to her body was just too great. In an instant, most of her internal organs were gone, swallowed up by the beast, and more than half of her body's blood was dumped out. Ian and the twins stared open-mouthed. It had happened so quickly that they hadn't comprehended what took place immediately. But then all hell broke loose. One of the children started to scream. Another clawed at his father, trying to launch his tiny little body into the current to save his mommy. Ian, screaming for help, could only try to hold on to his children, keeping them from jumping into the water themselves. His colleagues below were still preoccupied with their game. They hadn't even realized that there was literal murder happening above their heads. And his other colleague just stared, catatonic and completely dumbfounded at the horrific scene that played out before him. Therese's legs were bobbing a few feet away from the boat, while her upper torso began to sink under the waves. The shark circled around and grabbed up Therese's torso just as she was about to submerge completely. And also, at the same time that the divers from below surfaced, they saw the crimson water, the macabre sight of two legs floating beside them, and they even caught a glimpse of Therese's brown hair poking out of the gigantic shark's mouth just before it disappeared again. It wasn't hard to put the pieces together after such a sight. Dropping their muscles, they made a dash for the boat, scrambling to get to safety. Each man grabbed one of the flailing children before Ian lost his grip on his hysterical babies and yelled for the third man to get the boat in gear and drive. The reality was clear. Therese was dead. They needed to get out before one of the children landed in the water themselves, and if they were quick enough to get to the authorities, there might be something of the mother of five left to bring back home. With one last look over their shoulders, they saw the 15-foot beast rear out of the water for a third time, this time going for the pair of legs that were still attached to the shattered hip bones. They didn't stick around long enough to see whether or not the shark had gotten all of Therese. As they headed towards safety, they radioed for the Coast Guard and met the search team on the beach. But authorities didn't have an easy job of locating the rest of Therese. Besides a single leg floating on the surface, there was no safe way to send divers down to look for anything else. It wasn't just that single shark out there that had eaten the young mother. There were other carnivores feeding on the sea lions and seals too, and the blood and carnage wafted into the deep ocean, drawing all sorts of sharks to the area. And when they saw a pack of orcas in the area, all attempts to look any further were abandoned. It was just too dangerous to even sail on the water now, let alone expect divers to go down. No, the Cartwrights had no choice but to live the rest of their lives with the trauma of seeing their wife, mother, and friend quite literally ripped in half in front of their very eyes. They will never forget the day they witnessed Therese's horrifying final affliction.